Okay, so the next step is for us to go ahead and create our templates and also our handlers. And the way we're going to approach this is in an incremental way. So we'll start by creating a very bare bones template, and after doing that, we'll start by adding interactivity step by step and also start creating our handlers that are going to allow us to add that interactivity to our to-do list application. So let's go ahead and create in here a new file, and this one is going to be count.html. And in here, let's go ahead and paste all of this stuff. And as you can see, we have in here, first of all, the total count and also the completed count. And at the moment, we'll leave both of these values as 0, and later we'll go ahead and pass these values from our Golang server. Next, we need to go ahead and create our form.html file. And as you can see, at the moment, both of these defined blocks are very bare bones, and that's again because we are going to incrementally start adding functionality to our to-do list application, so you can see exactly how everything connects between HTMX and Golang. And finally, let's go ahead and edit our index.html file. So we want to go ahead and paste all of this in here and remove this hello world. So as you can see, inside of our index.html file, we're going to go ahead and call here both the total count and completed count blocks. And then we also want to go ahead and pass here our form template. And finally, go ahead and range through all of our items, and then simply go ahead and pass in here our item template for each one of these items. Before you continue, let's go ahead and ensure that we don't have to restart our server over and over again when we are making changes to our templates or our Go code. So let's go ahead and use air to be able to essentially have hot reloading inside of our application. To install air, simply go ahead and search here for the air repo on GitHub. And then down here, as you can see, after you have Golang installed in your system, you simply need to go ahead, copy this command, and then go ahead and install it. Since I already have air installed on my local machine, we can simply go ahead and move here back to our project directory. And then let's go ahead and run the air command. And as you can see, it is watching all of these directories. And then it is going to go ahead, build our project and also run it. And again, each time that we go ahead and make a change to our project, this is going to go ahead and rerun the entire Go program automatically for us. Now, to ensure that we don't commit here our temporary folder, we can simply go ahead and add here to our .gitignore file /temp, and then this is going to go ahead and ignore that entire directory again, so we don't go ahead and commit our executable to our GitHub repo. Now we are ready to go ahead and create the first handler that is going to allow us to render all of our tasks. So this is essentially the path that we want to go ahead and navigate later too, so we can then display our entire to-do list application with the tasks and also the completed and total count. So let's go ahead and create here a new file, which we'll call handler.go. And inside of this file, let's go ahead and first of all define our package name. And after doing this, go ahead and type func and then handle get tasks. Now let's go ahead and define the arguments for this function. So the first one is dub, which is http.responseWriter. And after that, we want to have here a pointer to http.request. So let's go ahead and type this in here. And after doing this inside of this function, we need to first of all go ahead and grab our items and also handle the possible error. So let's go ahead and fetch here our tasks. And after doing that, let's go ahead and say that if the error is different than nil, we want to go ahead and log this to the console. So let's go ahead and say in here error fetching tasks, and let's go ahead and pass the error in here. And then we simply want to go ahead and return here this function. After this, let's also go ahead and grab our tasks count. So let's go ahead and say count and then also the error. And then go ahead and type in here fetch count. And if the error is different than nil, let's go ahead and also log here a message to the console, which in this case, it is going to be error fetching count. And then we also want to go ahead and pass the error in here. Next, let's go ahead and define our completed count, which at the moment we haven't gone ahead and created a function for. So let's simply set this as 0. So we want to go ahead and type here completed count which at the moment is going to be 0, and we're going to, in just a second, go ahead and create the function so we can grab the count of only our completed tasks. And finally, let's go ahead and create our data struct and then go ahead and render our template. So let's go ahead and type in here data column equals, and then we want this to be tasks. And in here, let's go ahead and pass our items. Let's go ahead and pass our count. And finally, let's also go ahead and pass our completed count. And after that, just like I said, let's go ahead and grab here our template instance. And then we want to go ahead and execute a template. Let's pass in here our response writer. Let's say that we want to render our base template. And after doing that, let's also go ahead and pass as the last arguments our data. And to ensure we don't get any warnings, let's go ahead and ignore here our request. And now we are ready to go ahead and call this handler each time that a request is made to our base path. So let's go ahead and replace all of this with handle get tasks. Now, before we move on, let's go ahead and fix a little mistake that we made previously. So as you can see here, we have error fetching tasks, no such column, and that's because we have a typo in here. So if we move back here to task.go, and if you take a look up here, as you can see, this should be position. So if we go ahead and save this file, now, as you can see, Error automatically goes ahead and rebuilds our project for us. And now if we move back here to our browser, as you can see, we get here total tasks, we get the completed tasks, and we have here the placeholder where our form will be, and also 2 different items, which I've gone ahead and inserted into the database. So as you can see, I created here task 1 and task 2. And if you go ahead and create also another task, and then we also define here the completed value and the position. And if we go ahead and save this, now if we refresh here our browser, as you can see, we now have 3 different items, which will later display the information and also the actions related to each particular task. Next, let's go ahead and display the actual count values that we get from our database. So let's simply go ahead and navigate here to our count.html file and replace this with curly braces, and in here we want to pass the count value. And let's also do the same thing here for the complete count, so we'll pass this as count. And after doing that, let's go ahead and navigate here to our index.html file, and in here, using Sprig, we want to go ahead and use the dict function, and then we want to pass in here count, and in this case it is going to be count, and we want to pass also in here our count, but in this case it is going to be the completed count. And now if we navigate here back to our browser, and if we refresh, as you can see, we have total tasks 3 and then completed task 0, and that's because we are passing the hard value of 0 here inside of our handler. But if you go ahead and make here an adjustment, let's say that we want to display 3 as the completed count, and then if you go ahead and refresh our program here, as you can see, we now have here 3 completed tasks. Now, to ensure that we are actually grabbing the value that you have inside of the database for the completed count, let's move back here to our task.go file, and then let's look here for the count function. So as you can see, we have here fetch count, and let's simply go ahead, copy this, paste this down here, and then let's go ahead and call this one fetch completed count. And instead of this SQL query, we want to say that we want to select the count from tasks where completed equals 1. And after doing that, we can simply go ahead and replace this with the function. Let's also ensure that we are using here the error. And then we can simply say that we have, in this case, an error fetching the completed count. And now if we take a look here at our database, as you can see, we have at the moment 2 different tasks that are set as completed. So if we move back to our browser here, as you can see, we have here number 2. And if we go ahead and let's say that we want to modify task number 1 to not be completed anymore, we now get here 1 as the number of completed tasks. Now let's go ahead and create our form input, so we can go ahead and make requests to our server and then create a new task, so we can later go ahead and return all the information that we need back to the browser. Let's also go ahead and close this tab right over here. And after doing that, let's go ahead and inside of our define form block, simply go ahead and paste all of these. And now let's start by building this entire thing so we can have interactivity with HTMX. Before we continue, if you want to learn more in depth how to build a SaaS application from scratch using HTMX and Go and get one-on-one help when doing it, click the link below to join the HTMX Go SaaS Blueprint, a complete A to Z course on how to build and launch a SaaS application using HTMX, Go, PostgreSQL, and other technologies. I'm still building the course, so if you want to get notified and get free access to exclusive videos before they are released, go to webdevfuel.com/HGSB or click the link in the description below to go ahead and sign up. As you can see at the moment, if we go ahead and refresh the browser, we now have here this input available to us that we can go ahead and then click this button to submit, but at the moment, as you can see, nothing happened when it comes to HTMX, and that's because we still need to add all of those attributes to ensure that it communicates correctly with the server. Now in this case, we only need two very simple attributes, and that is the hx-post. So let's go ahead and type this in here, and we want to make a post request to /tasks. Now what this essentially means is that when we go ahead and submit this form, and actually I made the mistake right over here, we don't need to add it to the input element, we actually need to go ahead and add it to the form element. So again, when we go ahead and submit this form right over here, it goes ahead and passes a new request to our server, and it also goes ahead and sends in this case, all of the information that we might have inside of inputs, which in this case is only going to be the title of the new task that we want to go ahead and create. And finally, since we want to go ahead and swap this entire form after we get a new response from our server, we want to go ahead and add in here hx-swap, and then we want to ensure that we are swapping the outer HTML, and that's because we are essentially going to go ahead and replace this entire form element and also go ahead and clear this input field when we get a response back from the server. Now let's go ahead and save this file, and then let's go ahead and move here back to our browser, and if we take a look at the network tab, and we then refresh this page and we make a request, as you'll be able to see, this now tries to go ahead and make a HTTP post request to /tasks, but because we don't have this handler defined yet, this simply goes ahead and returns back to us a 404 not found, and that's exactly what we want to go ahead and do right now. We want to go ahead and create this handler and also make sure that our server handles this when we make a post request to the server. So let's go ahead and navigate back to the handler.go file, and in here let's go ahead and define a new function that we'll call handle create task, and this one is also going to take these two arguments, so let's go ahead and simply copy them and paste them in here. And then in this case we actually need access to our request, so let's go ahead and ensure that we have here access to it via this R variable. And now let's go ahead and grab our title value from the request. So let's type in here title and then column equals, and after that let's type R and then form value, and the argument for this is simply the name that we've defined for this particular form value, which in this case is title. Now let's go ahead and check if this title is an empty string, and if it is, we simply want to go ahead and return our form template back to the browser. So let's go ahead and say in here, if the title is an empty string, we want to go ahead and grab here our template instance and then execute a new template, pass in here our response writer, and then we want to tell it that we need to render here our form template. And after doing that, let's simply pass here the data as nil. Let's also make sure that we are returning this function so the code doesn't continue running. And after doing this, if we have an actual title that we can go ahead and use, we now want to go ahead and insert this into our database. So let's go ahead and say item, then also go ahead and grab the error. And we want to go ahead and insert a new task into the database. And let's pass in here as the first and only argument our title. Next, let's go ahead and handle this error. So if the error is different than nil, let's go ahead and ensure that we are returning. And we want to go ahead and print to the console a error message. So let's go ahead and say that we got an error inserting our task. And then let's also go ahead and pass the particular error. And before moving forward, let's actually ensure that we are executing this template up here. so that no matter what happens inside of this function, we are actually going to go ahead and return this form to the browser, and later we'll go ahead and add some kind of error handling into this equation. So we'll essentially add a new variable that we can call, for example, error, so we can then go ahead and track our error and display it to our user inside of the browser. But for now, we can simply leave this as is, and actually let's put this here at the top. And next, let's go ahead and also grab our total number of tasks from our database. So later, when we go ahead and actually swap all of the elements inside of the page, we have access to the new number of tasks inside of the browser. So let's go ahead and type in here count. Let's also grab the error, and then we want to simply go ahead and call here this function, which is the fetch count function. And let's also ensure that we are handling this error. So let's go ahead and say if the error is different than nil, we want to go ahead and do the exact same thing. So let's go ahead and say error fetching count. And now let's also go ahead and make sure that we are ignoring both of these values, because we don't actually need them right now. And finally, let's go ahead and add this handler to our router. So let's go ahead and say that when we make a post request to /tasks, we want to use this function, which is handle create task. And before we go ahead and make sure that all of this is working inside the browser, let's actually make sure that we are in line with HTTP standards. So let's go ahead and make sure that we are returning the correct response header from this function. So let's say in here dub.writeHeader, and then in here we want to pass the status code of created, which is 201. And to ensure that this runs correctly, let's move this down here. And now if we go ahead and save this function, and after doing this, let's go ahead and move back to the browser. And now let's simply go ahead, refresh here this page, and if we go ahead and create in here task number 4, as you can see, we get here a 201 response back from the server. And if you go ahead and refresh this page, as you can see, we now have 4 different items. Now the next step is for us to go ahead and ensure that when we go ahead and create a new task, the total count gets updated without us having to go ahead and refresh the page. See, because if we take a look at this, as you can see, we have in here the total number of tasks. And if we go ahead and create a new one, this task actually goes to the server and gets created, but the state here is not reflected inside of our browser. So let's go ahead and move back to our code editor, and in here inside our count.html file, let's go ahead and make a couple of adjustments to this template so we can again go ahead and swap this value when we get the value back from our server. So what will essentially happen in here is that we want to make an out-of-bounds swap. So HTMX essentially ignores this entire element when we go ahead and return it back to the browser, and instead it goes ahead and looks through all of our HTML inside of the browser and then does a swap based on the ID that will go ahead and pass to the HTMX attribute. So let's go ahead and type in here an if statement. So if.swap OB, which is a boolean value that will pass to this total count block. And then let's also go ahead and close this if statement. And if this is true, we want to go ahead and add the following attribute. So let's go ahead and type in here hx dash and then swap OOB. And in here we want to pass the value of inner HTML and then column, and we want to tell it to go ahead and swap the total ID, which is this one right over here. Now what this essentially means is that HTMX is going to go ahead and look through our entire HTML for this particular ID, and then it is going to go ahead and swap only the inner HTML, which means that this is going to go ahead and ignore this entire P element, and then it is simply going to go ahead and swap this entire part inside of here. So we can essentially have the swap of this count value, and each time that we go ahead now and create a new task, we'll get the new total count value inside of our browser. And again, since we are doing an out-of-bounds swap, we can safely go ahead and return this next to our template that we are returning right over here. So we go ahead and return this form element as quote-unquote the main response to our browser, and this is going to safely be ignored, and it is going to be swapped only based on this particular ID. So now let's go ahead and return back here this from our function. So we essentially want to also go ahead and execute next to this template here our total count block. So let's go ahead and type in here temple and then execute template. We want to pass in here our response writer, and then in here we want to specify our total count block. And the data that we need to pass in here is the following. Let's create a map where the keys are strings and then the values are any. And in here we need to go ahead and pass our count, which is the new count that we get from our fetch count method right over here. And then after that, let's also go ahead and pass our swap OOB value. So let's say swap OOB, which in this case is going to be true. And we actually need to go ahead and add here a column to make sure that this variable gets initialized correctly. And after doing that, let's also go ahead and pass here to this template the value of false, because when we go ahead and make here the first render, we don't want this to be an out-of-bounds swap that's happening via HTMX, but instead we only want to go ahead and render it quote-unquote normally. So let's go ahead and type in here swap OOB, and then the value of this is going to be false. Now let's go ahead and close this file, and if we move back here to our browser and we go ahead and refresh and insert in here a new task, as you can see we now have here the total number of tasks as 6, and if you continue adding, as you can see, it increments correctly, and that's because we have in here an out-of-bounds swap. So let's just take a look here at HTML so we can see exactly what's happening. So as you can see, we have here the ID of total, and each time that we go ahead and create a new task, this goes ahead and swaps the inner HTML only. And we still need to make a little adjustment here to our function, and that's because, as you'll be able to see, if we go ahead and create a new task with nothing in here, so essentially with an empty string, this simply goes ahead and disappears, and that's because we are not returning here our template when we go ahead and check if the title is empty inside of this block. So let's go ahead and copy this from here, and let's go ahead and paste this in here. So now if we go ahead and refresh our browser, and then we go ahead and pass an empty string here to our input, as you'll be able to see, nothing happens. And again, we're going to go ahead in just a second and add an error message, so the user knows that this task actually needs a value, but for now we can leave it like this. Now let's go ahead and take care of our item block. So let's go ahead and move back to our form.html file. And here inside of our item block, let's go ahead and paste this entire HTML. And again, if you want access to this entire code so you don't have to go ahead and type it manually, I'll leave a link in the description below so you can go ahead and check the GitHub repo. First of all, we have here the ID of our particular task. We then have in here a button that we'll use in just a second to go ahead and do the reordering of our tasks. But again, I'll leave this for a later moment in this series. We then have here the title of our item. We then have here buttons to not only go ahead and delete a task, but also go ahead and toggle the edit state so we can go ahead and edit a particular task's title. And finally, we have in here our input, which is of type checkbox, so we can go ahead and mark each particular task as either completed or not completed. So let's go ahead and move back to the browser so we can see exactly how this looks. And as you can see, we have all of this stuff in here, but we haven't yet gone ahead and passed our particular item to this block, so we need to go ahead and move back here to our index.html. So let's go ahead and define in here a new dictionary, and the key is going to be item, and then we simply need to go ahead and pass in here a dot, and that's because we are going to go ahead and range through each one of our items, and then the data that we get from each one of those items, we, instead of simply going ahead and passing a dot in here, so we can then inside of the template, for example, access .title or .id, we actually want to pass additional data to this template, and that's why we need to go ahead and define in here the dictionary and pass this like this. And then inside of our template, we'll have access as you just saw. So let's just take a look at here. Here inside of, for example, our title, instead of simply accessing .title, we go ahead and type in here .item.title, and then we can again also go ahead and pass additional data to this item block. Now let's go ahead and move back to our browser, and if we go ahead and refresh, now as you can see we have here the names of our tasks, and we also have here all of this stuff still correctly working. And as you can see, we now have here the name of all of our tasks. But one thing that you might have noticed is that we still don't have here the completed value. So let's go ahead and take care of this. So let's go ahead and move here down to our checkbox, and let's add in here an if statement. So we want to say that if this is .item.completed, then let's go ahead and close this. We simply want to go ahead and pass here the checked attribute. And now if we go ahead and refresh this, as you can see, in this case task number 3 is completed, so we get here the correct state on our first render. Now the next step is to ensure that when we go ahead and check or uncheck each one of these boxes, the state is correctly updated on the server, because at the moment if we go ahead and, for example, uncheck this and now we go ahead and refresh the browser, as you just saw, nothing happened yet. So let's go ahead and take care of this. So here inside of our input element, we simply need to go ahead and add the following HTMX attribute. So let's go ahead and type in here hx dash and then put, because we want to make a put request to our server when we go ahead and toggle this checkbox, and we want to make a request to /tasks. Then let's go ahead and pass in here the ID of the particular task that we are looping through, and then we want to go ahead and call /toggle. Now let's go ahead and save this file, and if we move back to our browser and we go ahead and refresh this page, let's move here to the network tab, and then if we go ahead and check or uncheck each one of those boxes, as you can see, it goes ahead and makes a request to the path that we've defined, but we still haven't created a code to handle this request on our server, so let's go ahead and do exactly that. So let's move back to our browser and inside our test.go file, and down here let's go ahead and create the function that will allow us to go ahead and toggle our task. So let's go ahead and call this one toggle task, for example, and this is going to take as the first and only argument the ID of the task that we want to toggle, and it is going to return an item and a possible error. Inside of this function, let's start by first of all defining a new item, and then let's go ahead and run the following query. So we want to go ahead and grab this error from our query, and then let's type in here db.queryRow, and let's go ahead and type the following SQL query. So we want to say that we want to update our tasks, and we want to set the value of completed. Now the value that we want to set as completed will be based on the value that currently exists inside of the database. So we want to say equals, and then let's go ahead and type case when completed. Then let's say equals 1, then 0, else 1, and then let's go ahead and end this. Now what this essentially means is that we want to go ahead and take a look at the particular task that we go ahead and pass the ID in here, and then if the value equals 1, we want to go ahead and define it as 0, or else we want to define it as 1, and what this essentially allows us to do is to go ahead and toggle the value inside of the database. Now we need to go ahead and specify which particular ID we want to go ahead and toggle the completed value of. So let's go ahead and say where ID equals, and then we want to go ahead and return the ID, the title, and also the completed value. Now let's go ahead and pass here the argument, which is our ID, and then let's go ahead and scan these columns into our item struct. So let's go ahead and say in here item.id, then we want the item.title, and finally item.completed. Now let's go ahead and handle this error. So if the error is different than nil, we want to return a new empty item and then the error, and if we don't get any errors, let's simply go ahead and return the item and the error as nil. And now let's go ahead and create the handler that will allow us to go ahead and toggle our task. So down here let's go ahead and type handle toggle task, and again exactly like both of these ones, we want to simply go ahead, copy this and paste this in here. And then let's go ahead and inside of this handler, go ahead and type the following ID and then error. And let's go ahead and transform first of all our ID from a string into an integer. So we want to use here this string conversion package, and then let's go ahead and call this method. And inside of this, we want to go ahead and use the she router to go ahead and grab the ID of the particular task. So like you just saw here inside our form, as you can see, we'll pass here our task and then here the ID of the particular task. So we want to go ahead and grab this from the she router. So let's say in here she.url param. And then we need to first of all pass in here our pointer to the http.request and finally the key of our URL param, which will be ID. Next, let's go ahead and handle this error. So if the error is different than nil, we want to go ahead and print the following message. So let's say error parsing ID into int, and then let's go ahead and pass here our error value. Next, let's go ahead and toggle the task inside of our database. And the first thing that we get from this function, we actually want to go ahead and ignore it in this case. And then let's simply go ahead and grab the error, and we can then go ahead and call here our toggle task function that we just went ahead and created. Let's also go ahead now and pass in here our ID, and then let's go ahead and handle our error. And in this case, we can simply go ahead and copy this from here and then paste this in here. And let's say that we got an error when toggling, for example, our task. And let's also ensure that we are returning this here, and also in this case, the same thing. And finally, let's go ahead and save this file. And actually, before we move on, let's ensure that we are ignoring here our response writer, because at the moment we still don't need it. And finally, we need to move back here to our main.go file and ensure that we are properly routing this request. So let's type in here r.put, then let's type in here /tasks, then let's pass in here the ID and finally toggle. And we want the function to be handle toggle task. So now if we move back to our browser and we go ahead and refresh this, and we now try to, for example, toggle here a random task. As you can see, if we now go ahead and refresh the browser, the state of this particular task was successfully updated inside of the database. Now we still have one last thing to do related to toggling our tasks, and that is to update here our completed tasks when we go ahead and toggle each one of these tasks. So as you can see at the moment, if we go ahead and toggle a task, the number of completed tasks up here is not correctly updated, and that's exactly what we're going to go ahead and do right now. So let's move back to our editor, and here inside our count.html file, let's simply go ahead and copy this entire part of our code, and then let's go ahead and paste this in here. And in this case, instead of swapping based on the total ID, we want to go ahead and look here for the completed ID. So let's go ahead and change this part. And then let's do a couple of adjustments also here inside of the index.html file. We want to ensure that we are passing here on the first render the swap OB as false. And finally, we can move back here to our handler. And now down here, we can simply go ahead and render our completed count block with the swap OB value passed as true. And then it is going to automatically go ahead and insert that new value into the browser. So let's simply go ahead and copy this part of our code so we don't have to go ahead and retype all of this again. Let's ensure that we have access here to our response writer, and then here inside, instead of total count, we want to go ahead and type in here completed count. And finally, let's go ahead and grab the completed count value from our database. So we want to type in here completed count, and then let's also go ahead and grab the error. And then let's run this fetch completed count function. And after doing that, let's go ahead and handle this error. So let's go ahead and copy this entire part. Then let's go ahead and paste this in here. And we can say, for example, that we got an error fetching completed count. And down here, let's go ahead and add our completed count value. And now if we go ahead, save this file and move back to our browser, if we go ahead and refresh this page and we go ahead and toggle, for example, our first task, as you can see, the completed tasks count is automatically updated via HTMX. Now the next step is for us to ensure that when we go ahead and create a new task inside of our to-do list application, the new task is correctly appended to our list here of tasks. So if we take a look at the current behavior of our application, it is the following. If I go ahead and create a new task in here, the task is actually going to go ahead and get created inside of our database. And we also get here the new total tasks, but we still don't have here our new task appearing at the bottom of our list. So that's exactly what we want to go ahead and do right now. So let's type in here temple, and then we want to go ahead and use here the execute template method. Let's also pass in here our response writer, and then in here we want to go ahead and call item. After doing this, let's also pass in here a map where the keys are going to be strings and then the values any. And finally, let's pass in here our item, which is the item that we get from here. So let's go ahead and actually define this up here. And now we can go ahead and pass this down here. And finally, let's go ahead and define our value of swap OB as true. And finally, let's go ahead and save this file. And now if we move back to our browser and we go ahead and refresh this, we actually get an error. So let's just take a look at it very quickly to see if we have any kind of mistakes in here. So we type all of this probably, yes. Then let's also take a look here at our index.html. Okay, so we have a mistake in here. So as you can see, we've passed here the dictionary incorrectly. So we have item and then swap OB, then false, and finally the dot. And what we actually want to go ahead and do is pass in here the dictionary, then the item, and after that the dot, and then swap OB as false. So now let's go ahead and save this file. And if we move back again to our browser, now as you can see, all of this is being rendered correctly. And now if we go ahead and create a new task, as you can see, this gets appended to the end of the list correctly.